So, first of all, I introduce Dr. Kirsten Cooke, both independent and collaborative curator, very interested in testing the curatorial formats within the gallery space and also within the spaces of education. Snow Crash was a curatorial project performed in 2019, and if you look online at Snow Crash at the IMT Gallery, it exemplifies an approach that holds a speculative architecture for alternative infrastructures, one that is flexibly built to respond to the artworks that it houses. I also introduced Saim Demircan. Saim is an international curator, and I came across Saim really and approached Saim after seeing the Fausto Melotti theatre exhibition at Hauser and Wirth in 2022, really taken by the archival, shifting, theatrical approach to that as a curatorial project and how it moved the archive into a different context. So making curation visible with other narratives, other perspectives and relationalities. So basically, I just emailed his gallery representation. They very kindly gave me the permission to approach Saim, and he said yes. So here he is tonight. So it's an immense pleasure that I introduce Saim Demircan and Dr. Kirsten Cooke. First choreographer.
Thanks very much, Al and Edgar, for the invitation to speak today. And I'm going to be talking with Saim here, obviously, primarily about your work on choreography and documentation that's been built out of your curatorial practice, but now it's entering your doctoral research. And I think it would be nice actually to start with where Elle left off, which was the Fausto Melotti Theatre exhibition at Hauser and Wirth, which initiated the invitation to speak today. So could you start by introducing us to this and your curatorial practice, which engages with choreographing archives?
Sure. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me at the back okay? Great.
Good that you tested that. I just assumed.
Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, Elle, and thanks, Edgar, for the invitation tonight. I'll start with this image, which is of part of the exhibition that Elle mentioned called Theatre, and it was an exhibition of works by an Italian post-war artist called Fausto Melotti. And in a way, well, I think actually the first thing I'll say is that my work with artists isn't strictly archival, although it touches the archive, especially recently now that I'm doing a lot of research around dealing with archives. But this exhibition was a little bit of an exception in that it was the first show that I made with an artist who wasn't living. One of the things about the reason why the show was kind of thematicized around theatre, or the idea of theatre, is because researching Melotti's work, which I was unfamiliar with, involved, on a very sort of practical level, going to the foundation in Milan, run by his daughter, and looking through mainly documentation of past shows, a lot of archival material, more than actually seeing works in person. I mean, there's numerous works in public and private collections, but they're still not always easy to see. One of the in kind of thinking through what this exhibition could be, because Melotti made probably thousands of works in his lifetime. I knew very early on that I wanted to include these works that you can see here, which are called the teatrini, which means little theatres in Italian. And they're quite small-scale ceramic pieces. I think the largest one's probably about 50 centimetres high. And he made them throughout his lifetime. He was mostly active. Well, he was active between the 30s and the 80s until he passed away in 85. There was this really interesting period in during the Second World War where he turned to ceramics as a way actually to make a living, and made a lot of wares, so kind of pots and vases and things like plates, things like that, which he didn't consider to be his sculpture, for which he predominantly made and is known for as an artist. This is partly because there was still, a distinction between the ceramic arts and let's say high art at the time, and so I knew that I wanted these works to be central to the exhibition. And kind of going back to this foundation, repeatedly going back to it, and one day, kind of them knowing that I was also interested in the teatrini. One day, a guy who works there pulled this box down off the shelf, and it just said, labelled teatro, theatre, and in it were photographs and documents of actual theatre stage sets that Melotti had designed and then were made for an opera and a ballet in the 1980s, just up until he passed away. So let's say back between like 81 and sort of 84, 85. And it kind of then sort of, it's a bit of a eureka moment in that it's like, okay, it's almost like a fulfillment of what Melotti had been kind of making throughout his lifetime. There were other sculptures in the show that you can't see in this image that looked almost like kind of models for stage sets, and so kind of at the same time that this had happened, I'd called up a friend who has a pottery here in London called Troy Town Arts Pottery in Shoreditch, an artist called Aaron Angel, just to ask him about his advice on showing these teatrini, because they're quite unusual objects. You can't quite see the details of them, but they're like kind of miniature stages. And they were all kind of rectangular, but because they were fired in the oven kind of on their backs, they're very frontal. So, and I hadn't seen anything in previous shows that ways of displaying them that felt satisfactory. So I was talking to Aaron about what he thought, and because he's as well as knowing how to make and fire ceramics, he's also thought of different ways of showing his own work, and they've always been quite inventive. So he suggested this, showing them in an alcove, and then when we when I kind of told him that I wanted to thematise the show around theatre, he came up with this exhibition design, which was like a stage kind of cross between the cave mouth in Bomazzo in Italy and the kind of Greek theatre mask, the mouth in a Greek theatre mask. So it's very much about working with Aaron on this. It was very much kind of treating the exhibition as a space of dramatisation as well as the show itself being kind of looking at Melotti's work through the lens of theatre. This is, and then outside of the exhibition, in the bookstore were these two vitrines with the archival material that I'd found in this box. It's pretty much all of it.
Okay, lovely. We were particularly taken with the way that you theatricalised the works themselves. So it was this idea of staging this voice rather than necessarily treating it as documentation and activating that through the space, because there were also a series of maquettes, weren't there?
Yeah.
And in this sense, it felt like we were encountering a liveness of this aspect, which fit with the performative theatricality of the staging of the original work anyway. And I wondered whether, in talking with Aaron, you discussed this kind of potentiality and this nature of it being alive and the audience's encounter with that.
I think the way that I got to Aaron was I'd worked with an artist previously on, several times on shows that were very intimate, very much like the artist's installations. Mm-hmm. So they were kind of, they were group shows that kind of took place in these very heavily designed kind of environments, interiors that often emulated other interiors or landscapes. And so that's something I can never really do myself. Mm-hmm. You know, it's too much of an imposition on an artist's work. But so I think, having done that with this other artist in the past kind of gave me the confidence to approach Aaron, and it was very much, it's Aaron was able to sort of answer questions that I couldn't really ever sort of answer in terms of like how to show this particular material. It extended, this idea of kind of applying the idea, the sort of notion of theatricality to Melotti's work is something that I kind of proposed, because the other sculptures in the show, while they looked like maquettes, there's nothing to say that they were ever kind of propositions for theatrical productions. But since they were kind of made around a similar time that he started to work on actual theatre productions, and actually this sort of chapter in the artist's kind of lifetime and practice was somewhat, well, there was nothing really other than a kind of brief mention of chronology that he'd designed a theatre, an opera and a ballet in the 80s. There hadn't been anything kind of written on this. So I was hoping that it would sort of add this extra sort of chapter or addendum to what had already been, how he'd already been historicised, and also kind of bring it also in a way to do this almost like a retrospective exhibition, in that, because the works, there's at least one teatrini from every decade, from the 30s to the 80s in this alcove. So it's almost like doing this sort of retrospective overview of his practice, but very much funneled through this idea of theatre that was both kind of actualised in the space through the design of the show.
Okay, lovely. However, we are actually going to mainly focus on your current doctoral research, and I think we want to provide a little bit of context for what we're going to end up looking to in more detail, because it sort of came out of your time as curator at the Kunstverein in Munich. So could you provide some context to that before we delve into thinking through these artworks that are situated around the Kunstverein?
For those of you who might not be familiar with the Kunstverein, Kunstverein in German means art association, and there are basically Kunstvereine all over Germany, and they're members-based small institutions or public galleries that are almost completely funded through these membership schemes, which are open to anyone and kind of start from like 60 euros a year, something like this. It's a model that dates back to the early 1800s. The Kunstverein in Munich, where I worked for 3.5 years between 2012 and 2015, opened in 1823. So this year is its 200th year anniversary. And it has quite a storied past, which we're going to get to and speak to in a bit. But one of the things that happened while I was there, the way that my research, the way in which my current research sort of originated was through an artist called Stefan Dillermuth, who was until very recently a professor at the academy in Munich for a long time, until he retired a year or two ago, and who I'd met very early on, very soon after moving to Munich, and in 2015. He was in the process of digitalizing video footage he'd taken of this artist-run space called Friesenval 120 that he co-ran in Cologne in the early 90s. And so we were kind of looking through hours of these videotapes and decided to screen footage he'd filmed of exhibitions that he'd organised at this artist-run space, and have a discussion about Friesenval. And while I was kind of looking at this footage during the event, it occurred to me that the role of subjectivity is somewhat overlooked in when it comes to exhibition histories. The footage itself is very, it's really just someone with a video camera walking through a space. It's very kind of handheld, and you can and kind of rough in that respect. But it kind of got me thinking about this idea of agency and who the role of the documentarian and who that person is documenting exhibitions. After the screening, we published an interview about his use of video at the time, and I then included some of the footage he'd taken in a screening program that took place at the ICA here in London in 2016 as part of what used to be the Artists Moving Image Biennial that was organised by Stephen Cairns, and that screening was called Exhibition on Film, and it included other artists who similarly filmed exhibitions either as artworks or as a form of documentation in its own right. And then in 2017, I was the Goethe Institute's curatorial resident in New York for a year, which involved programming this small exhibition space they had in the Lower East Side for 12 months. And as part of that, I co-curated this exhibition called Exhibition as Image, Art Through the Camera's Eye. And Art Through the Camera's Eye is together with an artist and photographer called Eric Bell, who'd told me about this really great essay by Robert Smithson called Art Through the Camera's Eye. And so we showed in the back of the space that you can kind of see in this image was a kind of re-edited screening program with a lot of the films that I'd included at the ICA together with some films that Eric suggested. And in the front is this piece by an artist called Judith Barry. And I think it's just sort of worth briefly talking about this piece because I think it sort of speaks to this idea of choreographing the archive. It's very hard to sort of tell from these images what they are, but basically they are 3D printed installation shots of an exhibition that Judith had designed as part of her participation in a show that took place at the New Museum in New York in 1986 called Damaged Goods. And it's a show that's sort of one of the first first exhibition to group artists associated with appropriation art at the time. And Judith's participation was designing it. I saw these three dioramas, I think is the best way of describing them, in a survey show on artistic practices around 1990 that took place in Vienna around 2015, and was kind of fascinated by them. And Eric and I were fortunate enough that, Judith lived quite nearby in New York and had a copy, an exhibition copy that we could include in this show. Basically, just to explain what they are, is she was asked to, as part of this survey show, she was asked to recreate her exhibition design for the damaged goods. But instead of treating that as a kind of ready-made, she 3D printed installation shots so that the image, everything in the background is on this, you can kind of imagine a 12-inch LP record kind of stood upright on the background, and then all the objects in the foreground of the image were 3D printed and which you can see in the in the foreground. So they're these really strange objects. I don't really know exactly how to categorize them, but that's very much a lot of what I'm kind of looking at is falls somewhere between art and documentation. In this case, I think there's this sort of slippage between photography and sculpture, and I think it's a grey area, but it's quite fascinating. The last kind of iteration of this project was a show called Just Exhibition as Image that happened in New York in end of 2021. Sorry, at a university gallery called ATWSC, which is NYU's university gallery, kind of similar to what CCA is in relation to Goldsmiths here. And in that was a more expanded kind of version of this show and the kind of screening programs that I'd done prior to that, which included this work by Judith, but also more historical pieces such as, and I'm going to bring up images, close-up images of this later. This is a series by Hans Harker from 1959 of Documenta 2, the large-scale exhibition that takes place in Kassel in Germany every 5 years, which he took while he was a student at the Kunsthochschule in Kassel at the time. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that later on. And that was together with this film by René Green called Venue, which is a kind of 30-minute document of a show called Taste Venue, which took place at Pat Hearn Gallery in New York in 1993, and for which she made the gallery bookable space for the duration of the show. So the question there is like, how do you document a show that's sort of live or ephemeral in nature? And this video is really fascinating because rather than a straightforward kind of documentary, let's say, of everything that took place at the gallery during this time, there's a lot of footage of, there's only footage of two events, a concert and a fashion show. But there's a more footage of, for instance, the models being styled than there is of the actual event, or a few seconds of the end of the concert, and then a lot of footage of the people kind of at the door, like handing out splitting up the cash. Mm-hmm. So it's very much around, the question of like, what is the art comes up there, and it's I was really interested in how, let's say, the quote-unquote art object was framed by the things that were taking place around them. The other thing about this work in particular is, or this work is or peculiar, is at the end of it, the credits come up as a cast list. So it's almost as if what you've just seen is some kind of fiction, and so you can see here René Green together with her brother Derek Green with the booking agents. Pat Hearn is playing the role of the dealer, and that was shown together with a series called of film collaborations by Jeff Priest, who was a member of a cooperatively run gallery called Orchard in New York between 2005 and 2008, and for which he filmed several of the shows that took place there in collaboration with the artists who were taking part. This is a still from his collaboration with Andrea Fraser from the first show that took place at Orchard, and in which she, Andrea Fraser was also another member of the gallery, and she was performing her piece "May I Help You" from 1991 for the first time herself, and the piece is her acting as a dealer. So she comes out of the back of the gallery and basically delivers this monologue to whoever's visiting the show. Mm-hmm. What's amazing about this piece, and what kind of occurred to me when seeing this together with René Green and Hans Hucker's work together in the exhibition, together in the exhibition, was this idea actually of theatre, and the exhibition as being this sort of space of dramatisation, because what you realise when you're looking at this, for instance, is you're watching basically an actor come out on stage, because Jeff had filmed Andrea giving this performance over a week at different points in the day, at different inside the space, outside the space, and edited all this footage together into one sort of uninterrupted take. What it shows you is the level of rehearsal that she is capable of, because she never misses a beat. Mm-hmm. And you know, sort of in my naivety, never really thought about Andrea Fraser as an actor before, you know, all her work is as so highly rehearsed. So this idea of theatre, you know, theatricizing the exhibition really kind of comes through a lot of these subjective forms of documentation that I've been looking at.
And it also seems to be that you're questioning where theatre also happens. So there's the theatre of the front stage of the exhibition, or what is made visible within the archive, let's say, if we're thinking further back in your presentation. And then there's the theatricality of the decisions behind that, and the slippage of the lens to include the wider infrastructures that are being included within this frame, or the more personal and intimate ones that then disrupt maybe the usual rendering of what we state as an accurate documentation.
Yeah. And one thing that you'll kind of probably have noticed is that all these images include people, and that's something that official documentation of exhibitions doesn't or rarely actually shows you. You could sort of argue that nowadays, actually, you tend to see people in documentation of exhibitions, but it's very much used as a tool for publicity. I'm really interested in how the inclusion of people in documentation can contribute to histories, particularly exhibition histories, but they also counter what Brian O'Doherty says inside the White Cube, where he talks about the gallery, talks about space occupying bodies as being unwelcome in the gallery space. So there's this sort of project to kind of eradicate the person from the image, and in doing so, you could say that exhibitions, documentation of exhibitions, sort of exist in this kind of eternity of display, and actually, I'm really interested in locating exhibitions in time and space through different forms of of documentation.
Yeah, because the slippages outside of the institution and the bodies actually render it not timeless, whereas the white cube space kind of creates a kind of neutrality
Exactly.
that seems like it's timeless. Yeah. Okay, interesting. So I think it's important to go back to the Kunstverein here, because you reconnected with them due to this being the 200th year, which you mentioned, which is the anniversary of when they first began. And through that, you were invited to work within the materials of the newly created semi-autonomous archive room. Is that right? That's been installed. And you've also written a newsletter in relation to Renata Kern's snapshots of the institution. And what's quite interesting with those snapshots is they seem to be sort of being included in this semi-autonomous archive, sort of rewiring the archive from within. And I wondered if you could speak to that and what you were thinking through in terms of your newsletter.
Yeah, so as part of this 200-year anniversary, the current director, Marion Dietrich, when she started, so the other thing to say about these Kunstvereins is that the directors have a 5-year period, which is actually sort of quite healthy because you get sort of plurality of programming. The current director, Marion Dietrich, when she started, this will be her, I think, 5th year, already had to kind of factor in that she would, it would be the 200th year anniversary while she was director, and made preparations for this by designating one of the 4 rooms in the Kunstverein as an archive room, and making the archive much more, both more visible, but also made a position for a part-time archivist to help prepare for this anniversary, and as part of that would commission and write these newsletters that would be emailed out sporadically over the years leading up to this June, and it's a really great idea, and last year Marion and I were talking about my research, and she asked if I could apply it to the Kunstverein's archive for one of these upcoming newsletters. So somewhat, given the kind of nature of what I'm sort of interested in, the proposition itself was very attractive too, because it was very much, rather than me kind of like coming across something like I have done with a lot of these works, it was actually kind of going with a specific intent into an archive and finding, let's say, unofficial forms of documentation, amateur or incidental forms, and was led somewhat naturally to a series of photographs taken by Renata Kern, who was the Kunstverein's an office manager for between 1977 and 2007, and who had donated these snapshots to the archive, in the last few years. So I'll just show you a couple of images from that I used to kind of illustrate this newsletter. What's really, I think, interesting about these is that they don't look like much on the face of it, but Renata had a knack for somehow kind of capturing interactions between people in these images, or kind of especially sight lines between people, and a lot of the photographs kind of cover this period in the late 80s and 90s, and the kind of succession of three directors in particular, Zdenek, Felix, Helmut Draxler, and Dirk Schnauwart. And this is Helmut Draxler that you can see here in the image at the opening of Andrea Fraser's exhibition, Eine Gesellschaft des Geschmacks, which means a society of taste. This is another image in which you can see Andrea Fraser there in the background, kind of looking at Helmut Draxler, and this is a board member here. And what's sort of quite interesting about these images is that you see this side of the Kunstverein which I don't think official documentation really captures, because of the nature of these members-based organisations. It's very much to do with civic patronage and social status. So, being on the board of the Kunstverein is a coveted position and it's mainly sort of upper class professionals and collectors who occupy these who make up these boards. And they're very much in control of these not in control of the program, but their biggest sort of role in a way is like the choice of who the director is. So there's this very close relationship between the board of directors and the director and the directors, and you can kind of see this interaction sort of here with the artist in the background. And Andrea Fraser's show was all about this relationship between the board of directors and the Kunstverein, because the show itself was a series. She'd interviewed all the directors and had kind of made this sort of script out of the interviews that were then pasted to the walls. This is another photograph of Helmut Draxler and Dirk Schnauwart in the background. Again, you can sort of, one director succeeding the other, but that's sort of, that relationship is, that sort of passing of the baton is sort of captured in this image. And I just was so fascinated by this role that Renata, this sort of position that she had as someone who was very much sort of in, working within the institution itself, and the nature of her job was actually sort of keeping the place running,
Yeah.
And this dual role as a member and of the Kunstverein and but also a member of the audience. So you'll see here that these, because you sort of see like someone's shoulder or at the edges of these, another body at the edges of these images, you understand her that from the position of an audience member. One of the other things about these snapshots is they reminded me of Hans Hake's photographs from '59, and perhaps the obvious thing to say here is that you can't actually see any artworks in these images. The artworks are obscured, or they're in the background, and it again sort of speaks to this idea of theatre, I think. Hans Hake, I remember seeing this talk that Hans Hake gave at Tate Modern, in 2009 about in a conference about landmark exhibitions, and he was talking about his time working on Documenta 2 as a student, which is when he took these photographs, and he described the founder of Documenta, Arnold Border. He described his own labour as that of a stagehand, because Arnold Border, the founder of Documenta, had come from a background in theatre and was applying sort of ideas of Inszenierung or mise en scène to exhibition design. And Hans Haacke was sort of fascinated by sort of interactions that were between people that were taking place during the exhibition. So the social interactions between, the public and the press and the dealers and the gallerists and the artists, the curators, and kind of seeing the sort of machinations of the art world sort of playing out as if on stage. And in that respect, art becomes, the theatrical backdrop to this almost choreography or sort of performance of that's happening in the images.
So in a sense, the exhibition withdraws and the actors come forward, and it becomes a kind of theatrical display of the different dynamics behind art fairs that are normally what is set behind the scenes, with the focus being on the work.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is the last image I'll show of Renata's. The reason I've included this one in particular is because it again sort of reminded me of the work of Louise Lawler, because Louise Lawler's entire predominantly photographic practice is of other people's artwork and exhibitions, but often frames art through the context in which they're shown. So, for instance, this is a Frank Stella painting, but sort of seen reflected in the floorboards of a museum, or art hanging in a collector's home or in a restaurant. Pays particular attention to features that are usually sort of kept outside of the frame, such as the seating, or maybe like wall fixtures, like plugs and things like this, and so just to go back to that image, I was really interested in how this is an image of the director I worked with, Bob van der Heide, yet he's framed by all the sort of symbols of the kind of bourgeois society that within which the Kunstverein operates. The sort of clothes, the bottle of champagne. Do you know what I mean? It's so I was sort of thinking about Renata's photographs through the way in which Hans Haacke had photographed Documenta 2, which the exhibition sort of recedes and the come out to the fore, and also the way in which Louise Lawler has made an entire practice of framing artworks within the context within which they're shown.
And it's also kind of highlighting the desires of the actual system, isn't it? And the systems that it goes through, and how art maybe is a conduit for these wider politics at play, which kind of really links us to what we mainly wanted to talk about, but we're running out of time on, which is the video by Tony Coates, which is Some Munich Moments, which was staged across the Kunstverein and the Haus der Kunst in Munich. And this was the kind of infamous exhibitions were held across these two spaces, which were the Entartete Kunst and the Great German Art Exhibition. And the Entartete Kunst was the degenerate art show. So it was very much politically used by the Nazi Party, but I'll let you go into that. But what's quite interesting within these videos is that the actual exhibitions as archive withdraw. They're only there very minimally at the very start of the videos. But when they withdraw, what they seem to highlight more is the city as archive, or the museum as archive, and the world stage as archive, as opposed to thinking about it being the actual exhibitions as archive. And so they kind of allow us to enter the kind of wider context, the historical and political context, and the kind of decision-making behind the stories that are told within the archive. I guess the question maybe is, how does this approach enable Cooke to provide a wider infrastructural frame to expose archival ideologies and methodologies in his work? So how do you see that operating?
So the work that you mentioned, some Munich moments. Well, maybe first of all, Tony. Some of you might have seen Tony Cooke's show at CCA here at Goldsmiths in 2019, I think. And if you aren't familiar with him, his work is predominantly video and very recognisably text on these brightly coloured backgrounds, edited together with archival footage, often from media. The show that took place between Kunstverein Munich and Haus der Kunst last year. Well, first of all, kind of why I want to sort of talk about it is because while I didn't work on this show, I was really, I thought it was quite remarkable, both a remarkable exhibition and also this new work was really fascinating because basically, just to give you a little bit of context here, what links these two venues, Haus der Kunst and Kunstverein Munich, who are, let's say, less than 10 minutes away from one another in Munich, are these two shows you mentioned, Haus der Kunst and Große Deutsche Kunstausstellung, which the latter of which inaugurated what was originally called Haus der Deutschen Kunst, House of German Art, in 1937. And this was, this is an image of it here. This was designed by one of Hitler's favoured architects called Paul Ludwig Troost, and finished in 1937, and is very much designed in this sort of neoclassical style. And the show that it opened with was promoting the Third Reich's idea or vision of what they considered art to be, which was basically sort of traditional and conservative. And then the day afterwards, in July 1937, and at the exhibition Entartete Kunst, or Degenerate Art, opened at what is now the Kunstvereins, where the spaces. It actually used to be the Plastercast collection, Haus der Plastercast collection in Munich. And this show was of mainly 20th century modernist and avant-garde art, and the intention behind it was to vilify this art as degenerate, and publicly. And all the art was taken from museum collections in the Nazis' attempt to purge the museums of this so-called degenerate art. And considering that a lot of the artists included in it were Jewish or leftist, it kind of comes as no surprise that the show itself was very anti-Semitic and anti-communist. What's so interesting about Tony Cooke's work is that while this exhibition in particular, Entartete Kunst, is sort of very well known and heavily researched and exhaustively sort of kind of looked at, especially academically. I also think that it's been somewhat fetishized curatorially because of its really because of its design. I don't have any photos of what it actually looked like, but the organisers of the exhibition had made these sorts of choices that, as a way to really criticise the work by, for instance, writing how much the museum had paid for the artwork, and listing the museum director's name, and then having derogatory sort of texts written on the walls around the artworks. But what Tony Cooke does is situate this exhibition in relation to the other one, which is its counterpart, and kind of choreographed the relationship between the two institutions. And this he did by using this passageway that is the midway point between Kunstverein Munich and Haus der Kunst, in which there's a few billboards. And this passageway was part of the kind of organisational rebuild of the city in the 70s in the lead up to the Munich Olympic Games that took place in 72, of which is also kind of constitutes part of Tony Cooke's new film. It's why the dates and brackets are from 1937 to 1972. Just maybe to try and speak to as quickly as I can, because I know that it's already an hour. This idea of the city, just to pick up on this idea of the city of the archive as archive. What one of the things that some of the footage, that Tony Cooke includes in both versions of this film. There was one version made for Kunstverein Munich and one for Haus der Kunst. Each beginning with footage from either of the shows that took place in each venue. It is this archival footage made by an anti-fascist documentary filmmaker called Willy Gronauer in 1945 of that shows the extent of the destruction of the city at the end of the Second World War. Each of the sort of almost like vignettes are prefaced with a title card listing the places, like either streets or places within the city and then what follows are a series of stills or pans of those places. So it's almost like mapping out the city through through its destruction in 1945. This is just another photo, still from this footage, and yeah, I was really sort of taken by this because partly because what it did was it showed you how and where these exhibitions took place within the city's history. You know, it took it outside of the exhibition itself as this isolated event, and you know, showed you the extent of destruction that was happening, sort of both, like, let's say, culturally, but also geographically within the city, and kind of creating this kind of topology of Munich at the in this time.
And so, do you see Coates as kind of provoking a situation in which the video can archive alternate lenses to what is the mainstream way that the Munich has presented itself, from the fact that you mentioned to me that Munich, unlike Berlin, doesn't bear any traces of the destruction and actually restaged itself fully, trying to be sort of neo whatever the version was of it before. So all the buildings are complete sort of copies, as it were. Do you think that the provocation here is that Tony Coates is saying that actually art can provide, through analysing different lenses and different footage, an alternative to the archive and be an archive itself?
I think that this piece, Some Munich Moments, is very much grounded in Tony Coates' past work, and you know, in a way, probably speaks to the decision why the organisers really approached him to do a show across both venues. This is also kind of I would say, like, a piece that he's made before, which you know, could almost be a counterpart to this, is this work from 1988 called Black Celebration, which edits together newsreel footage of uprisings that took place in American cities in black neighborhoods in the 1960s, together with quotes from Guy Debord and Barbara Kruger and Morrissey, and similarly in Some Munich Moments, also together with images of the buildings that were sort of burnt in these uprisings, destroyed in these uprisings, and you know, similarly, Some Munich Moments is mixing, sampling media footage, in this case, Billy Cronau's documentary footage, and quotes from opening speeches at each exhibition by Adolf Hitler and Adolf Ziegler, and also quotes from books on Otto Eichler, I think, the Olympic 1972 Olympic Games graphic designer. The the 1972 Olympic Games was the first time that the Olympics took place in Germany after since the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games. So it was very much intended to be this celebration of peace and part of Germany's project of cultural rehabilitation. However, it's some of you might know, completely overshadowed by the terrorist group, Palestinian terrorist group Black September, who killed and kidnapped members of the Israeli Olympic team at the time. Just aware of time, I don't know, maybe wait at this point to sort of wrap this up.
Yeah, and then open up to questions. So in this sense, in terms of Cooke's approach, which is to highlight, again, an attempt to salvage the image of Munich, right, through the Olympic Games, which was this idea it was going to be the Rainbow Games, it was going to be playful. And then despite that, they can't control wider politics, right? But it was still an idea of control and an idea of image, which is quite similar to this idea of the Great German Art Exhibition and the demonstration of the way an image should operate and the way a city could operate as image, right?
Yeah.
And then how that is archived and kind of falling into the trap of representing itself in such a way. And I just wondered, to go back to the question about whether, do you see that they've therefore invited Cooke's in to sort of produce a video as alternative archive, really? And that this is going to sort of provoke maybe some questions towards the archive and the Kunst of our own as they're making it right now.
Yeah. It's a really good question because, I'm quite hesitant to sort of describe Tony Cooke's work as documentary, because of its non-linearity in that respect, in how it sort of narrativizes a series of events. But also because his own subjectivity, the way in which his own subjectivity comes through in the construction of image and text and sound, that's the other sort of component to his work, important component to his work, also leaves quite a lot of space for interpretation on the part of the viewer. And this, there's a point in at the end of both versions of this film where there is this footage, which is there's a still from, which appears on screen after the credits. He quite often lists the source materials that he's used to construct his work, and it was very short, a few seconds long pan of Haus der Kunst, taken in 1945, not by the same filmmaker. It's unclear who took the footage. It's also kind of obvious that it wasn't Billy Cronauer because it's also in colour. But the thing that's so striking and kind of troubling, I think, about the inclusion of this footage, which repeats 3 times, is knowing that because Haus der Kunst is situated on the edge of Munich's largest public park called the Englischer Garten. It survived the bombings because it was camouflaged from above, so it just looked like it was part of the kind of tree line on the outskirts of this park. And you can see in this image here these sort of tendrils this is the camouflage netting that was used to cover it. So after having seen, this this footage of this destruction of Munich, which I think the city centre sort of, was 90% destroyed, going back to what you said about not really getting a sense of the extent of it now, because in comparison to somewhere like Berlin, because Bavaria being quite a rich historically wealthy part of Germany, it was able to rebuild very quickly after the Second World War, whereas somewhere like Berlin, if you see sort of empty plot, you can sort of perhaps safely assume that was a bomb site. So seeing this, for me, the way that I sort of look at that inclusion of this footage, especially the way it's repeated, is it's almost like saying, look what survived, this from this time as well. This extremely potent symbol of the Third Reich, which is still standing, and which is and its own history is something that the people, the organisers, the directors in particular, are always sort of dealing with and contending with, and in that sort of respect, Tony Cooke's Tony Cooke's is sort of them bringing Tony in to make a show, not only a retrospective show about his own work, but also to sort of tackle this history was, I think, a really kind of remarkable decision.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I think we should most probably open up to questions. So thanks, Saim.
Thank you for the talk. It was really, really interesting. I was kind of wondering, with your talk about theater, I suppose, and sort of more in the first half, what you think of what's the difference, I suppose, between performance, performativity, and authenticity, and sort of where those sort of exist mixed together. Yeah. Does it
between performance and authenticity,
or performance and performativity, I suppose. I feel there's a difference probably there between theater and fakeness. I don't know, and authenticity.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. My particular focus is on exhibition documentation, and that there was a certain point in time where I had to think about what to do with performance documentation, because that's a whole other, field, and I'm not sure exactly if I'm going to be able to answer your question, but it does make me think about the difference between, let's say, performing for the sake of documentation, or performing to camera, for instance, and how, this question of authenticity is actually sort of quite complicated, because, you could sort of make an argument that some performance art, for instance, is constructed, so how authentic really is it in that respect? And but it's interesting to think about, for instance, the way in which performance is restaged. In a way, your question sort of makes me think about Joan Jonas's work, for instance, that has, she was predominantly performing in the 1970s herself, but in the last sort of, let's say, decade or so, has had her performances restaged. And one of the ways in which that's able to happen, I think, is because she kind of kept a document of, it was actually published as a book in, I think, sometime in the 80s, called Scripts and Descriptions, and it's really beautiful publication, actually, but you realise that, it's totally possible to restage these performances because you've got all the instructions there in front of you. So there's almost like a foresight on her behalf as an artist to sort of think about, how these performances can be repeated, whereas other performance artists, it seems very much like that they could never ever really be recreated. I don't know how much that sort of answers your question, but sort of thinking about sort of the authenticity of performativity, in terms of its originality. Yeah.
You go first. Thank you. And thank you for the material and the animation and all of those things. I mean, as I was watching, I guess, the Munich Kunstverein shots, I was reminded of a certain version of Germany, this point in time in Germany and how wide and how kind of what civic meant in that kind of context. That's one kind of commentary. But I was also kept on thinking about all of these things existing, or the forms of visuality which you've conjured into this timeline, existing before social media, before the hyper-visualization of the way in which we engage with art, right? Or art circulates, let's put it this way. And I kept thinking back to, there's a book by Andy Warhol called America from 1985, which in a way seems to me to sit on a very interesting cusp, between an understanding of art whereby the action artifact recedes into the background as a facilitator for an event or an enactment of the performance of the institution. And I wonder I guess the question towards your project is, what are the outlines? You know what I mean? You talked about the difference between exhibition documentation and performance documentation, but in terms of the very visuality of your material and where that sits in terms of media history and social history, do you have a sense how you can contain that, or what's in, what's out?
Yeah, not really, not yet. One of the things that we were going to, because of time, didn't sort of get to, which maybe sort of speaks to a little bit about this, is that when you mentioned Andy Warhol in that publication in particular, which is really amazing, I've been looking at these Vogue photo shoots from the 40s, 50s and 60s, in which art appears in the background of these fashion shoots. There's a very famous one of Jackson Pollock's action paintings taken by Cecil Beaton in 1951, I think it is. But there's two fashion shoots in the 60s that took, one of which they both took place in exhibitions at the Wadsworth Museum in Connecticut, and one of them was used the exhibition Black, White and Grey as the backdrop, and that was one of that was an early show which in which artists labelled minimalists were grouped, but also pop artists, and also Andy Warhol, sort of one of his very early silkscreens appears in the backdrop. It's the one of I don't know what the title is actually, but it's of James Cagney holding 2 pistols, and it's a still from, I think, a film called Angel with Dirty Faces. But what's sort of really interesting about these photo shoots is, especially like thinking about the Cecil Beaton spread, is this sort of project at the time to pair fashion, American made clothing with what was at the time considered very contemporary art. And part of that was because there was an attempt by the US market to compete with the French fashion houses, particularly Christian Dior, which is what the models are wearing. The models are wearing American department store versions of Christian Dior's new soft look clothing in the 50s, but pairing them with someone like Jackson Pollock, who represented the avant-garde at the time, was a way of trying to kind of I sort of feel I'm paraphrasing a little bit what other people have said, but that I've read about how it was an attempt in the pages of these lifestyle magazines to try and shift the market towards American homegrown fashion, and art was quite often used as a backdrop in that respect. And someone like Andy Warhol, in particular, perfect artist to kind of do that with. I'm not sure how much that answers, but it's looking at looking at the way in which art is documented through the events that are taking place at the time is something that we were just talking about before the talk. I'm very interested in locating art in time and place,
Oh, there's one here.
Hi, I was just interested in, like the subjects of the photos, the kind of gallery photos, like how they, much about how the subjects feel about being in them, because it seems like really satirical and about sort of privilege and like this exclusive world. And, yeah, I was just interested to know.
In the photographs of that Renata Kern took.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've no idea, but it's they're on the surface they're very much snapshots of social events. It's like taking a photograph at a birthday party in a way. It just so happens that I think she had this kind of eye on capturing these relationships between people, but as for what they think, I don't really know.
Thanks for the talk. Just almost a follow-up question about these e-letters that you did for Constantine. So you do, can you tell a little bit more about this project? Like, you sent those images back into the newsletter. You wrote something like who got this newsletter was the same patrons that were like in the pictures. Like, maybe this can also inform like how people saw these images.
Yeah, so the archive newsletter series is something that kind of has come out of this the formation of this archive room and the appointment of a part-time archivist, which the Kunstverein never really had before. and the archivist who I worked with was quite often writing, at least the starting the start of this project was writing newsletters, and now there's this idea to have kind of guest contributors. I guess the newsletter is a way of, so maybe just to sort of go back to this question of, you know, how is the archive formed and by whom and what stories does it include or not. It's sort of a way of, I think newsletters are a way of maybe filling gaps in kind of like a history or very public history of the Kunstverein, from, you know, and with guest contributors trying to look at that from different perspectives as well. Not least, you know, quite. What's the way you were sort of talking about it earlier? In a way, kind of personal histories. You know, the fact that I had worked there and, you know, knew the spaces intimately. However, I was maybe just to clarify, the Renata Kern had donated this series of photographs that she'd taken to the archive. So it does actually sort of bring up this question of how is an archive formed and by whom. You know, where does who saves this material, who organises it, who's responsible for it? Is it open to other contributions? And I guess what I was trying to sort of do with that newsletter is not only kind of analyse these photographs in terms of the way that they were framed in relation to, you know, Hans Harker and Louise Lawler in particular, but to you know, think about this question of where is a space for a plurality of perspectives when it comes to the formation of archives, and could that, for instance, include these you know, quite sort of innocently sort of taken snapshots by someone who worked there for a long sort of period of time, and in a way could those documents contribute to a historical reading of the kind of infrastructure of a place like the Kunstverein? I think, you know, I would say yes, because it's speaking to that kind of public members-based bourgeoisie kind of audience.
And I think that's what you were drawing on, wasn't it? Is also how can it be disseminated, maybe beyond that?
Actually, like I was also thinking about like materially, like how does that become public? Like it was like an email newsletter, or was that something in the institution website, or was a publication? Like how does this?
How does it materialise, and who does it reach?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an email out, and it exists on the website. Yeah, so it is actually going to at least the current members of the Kunstverein, whether or not those are members that are sort of appear in these, or, you know, in these photographs. I wouldn't know, but yeah, it's kind of sick.
Yeah. Good timekeeping, Al. Yeah.
Do you have any opinions on like digital archives like Google Arts and Culture, of like these movements towards like, just collecting data and storing money?
I do have an opinion on that. which I haven't really sort of necessarily formulated in public for, but the Arts and Culture, Google Arts and Culture project, which MoMA, I think, used to categorise their archive, is, you know, the algorithm is basically identifying what artworks are in an image and then kind of hyperlinking those artworks to, you know, a database. And I think it's, you know, it's really just, of course it's a useful tool in terms of organising data, you know, and treating things as data, but I don't think it really does anything more than that. I think it's just a way of organising information that appears in an image. I'm really interested in looking at these images, not at them, but sort of into them. So, for instance, I guess I probably have a bit of a criticism, a critical sort of opinion of something like the Arts and Culture project, because it's really just about gathering and processing data, and it's not really about analysing or reading these images in terms of or actually sort of providing anything sort of substantial in terms of a point of view about the formation of these images. Funnily enough, Vogue's archive is extremely thorough, and it even includes, you know, the name of photographers and even models, and it's really comprehensive, and it's you know, much more instructive. Not to sort of pitch Vogue archives against sort of Google Arts and Culture, but just sort of it feels very algorithmic and less about sort of interpretation of the images.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Saim.
Yeah,
And
thank you,
thanks.
Saim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.